5,000 years ago, where the Tigris River carved its ancient path through rolling hills and fertile plains, a small settlement clung to a limestone cliff overlooking the rushing waters below. The inhabitants called their home after the stern deity they believed watched over their affairs from his temple high above the river. These early people could never have imagined that their modest trading post would one day give birth to the most feared empire the ancient world had ever known. The location was no accident. This settlement commanded the vital crossing point, where merchants traveling between the Iranian highlands and the Mediterranean coast had to ford the Tigris. Caravans loaded with precious metals from Anatolia, textiles from Mesopotamian centers, and exotic goods from distant lands converged on this strategic bottleneck. What began as a convenient stopping point gradually transformed into something far more significant, a hub of international commerce that would shape the character of an entire civilization. Unlike the great centers of southern Mesopotamia that drew their wealth from agriculture and the predictable flooding of rivers, this northern stronghold thrived on movement and exchange. Merchants, not farmers, dominated its early development. These shrewd dealers developed an intimate knowledge of distant lands, foreign customs, and the intricate networks that connected civilizations across vast distances. This cosmopolitan outlook would later serve future rulers well when they sought to build empires spanning multiple continents. The Tigris itself provided more than just a strategic crossing. Its waters enabled the settlement's growth, supporting agriculture in the surrounding countryside, while offering a highway for goods traveling downstream toward Babylon and the Persian Gulf. Fish filled the nets of local fishermen, while the limestone cliffs provided excellent building stone for temples and fortifications. Most importantly, the river's position along major routes meant that information flowed through the settlement as readily as merchandise, knowledge that proved as valuable as any commodity. During these earliest centuries, Sumerian influence shaped much of the local culture. The cuneiform writing system arrived with southern merchants, allowing local scribes to keep detailed records of commercial transactions. Religious practices borrowed heavily from Sumerian traditions, though the inhabitants always maintained their distinctive devotion to their patron deity. Temple architecture, artistic styles, and even urban planning reflected southern models. Yet each borrowed element was adapted to local needs and preferences. By 2000 BC, these northern merchants had established what amounted to the world's first international trading corporation. The archives discovered at Kultepe in central Anatolia reveal the staggering scope of these operations. Over 23,000 cuneiform tablets documenting sophisticated business partnerships that stretched across hundreds of miles. These weren't simple buying and selling arrangements, but complex ventures involving long-term contracts, insurance against losses, banking services, and elaborate credit systems. The Karam Kanesh, as the trading quarter at Kultepe was known, housed hundreds of merchants and their families who had relocated permanently to Anatolia. They lived in substantial houses, operated local workshops, and even established their own courts to settle commercial disputes according to their homeland's law. These expatriate communities sent a steady stream of profits back to their mother settlement, transforming the modest riverside community into one of the wealthiest centers in Mesopotamia. Silver flowed into the coffers in enormous quantities. The Anatolian highlands were rich in precious metals, and these northern traders had exclusive access to many of the most productive mines. They exchanged textiles, manufactured in local workshops for raw silver, then transported the precious metal throughout Mesopotamia, where it commanded premium prices. This silver trade created the economic foundation that would eventually support military expansion. The patron deity occupied a unique position in this emerging civilization. Unlike the deities of other Mesopotamian centers, who typically represented natural forces or abstract concepts, this divine being embodied the settlement itself. He was simultaneously the patron god, the physical community, and the political entity. This theological innovation created an unusually strong bond between religious devotion and civic loyalty. To serve the deity meant to serve the settlement. To expand his influence meant to spread the divine dominion. Local leadership emerged gradually from this theocratic foundation. Early rulers held the title Ishaku, meaning deputy or steward, indicating they governed on behalf of the divine patron, rather than claiming divine authority themselves. This concept of delegated celestial authority would later evolve into the ideology that justified conquest of foreign lands. Rulers didn't seek personal glory, they insisted, but worked to extend their patron's rightful dominion over the entire world. The earliest royal inscriptions reveal leaders intensely focused on commercial prosperity and religious devotion. Ruler Erisham I boasted of constructing temples and organizing commerce, not of military victories. His son, Ikunum, continued these priorities, strengthening the trading networks that brought wealth to the settlement. These merchant princes understood that their homeland's strength rested on economic rather than military foundations, at least during the early centuries. Everything changed with the rise of Shamshi-Adad I, ascending to the throne around 1813 BC. This ambitious leader transformed the territory from a prosperous trading center into a territorial state. Unlike his predecessors, this remarkable figure possessed the vision and ruthlessness necessary to build an empire. He conquered Mari, the great center on the Middle Euphrates, and established his son Yasma-Adad as its ruler. For the first time, the homeland's authority extended far beyond its original boundaries. The palace Shamshi-Adad, built at Mari, rivaled anything in Mesopotamia. Its 300 rooms included throne halls decorated with magnificent wall paintings, archives containing thousands of administrative documents, and workshops producing luxury goods for international commerce. The ruler's correspondence, preserved in the palace archives, reveals a leader obsessed with administrative detail and military efficiency. He personally directed everything from road construction to tax collection, from diplomatic negotiations to religious ceremonies. Under this remarkable figure's rule, the Northern Territory developed many institutions that would characterize the later empire. Professional armies replaced citizen militias. A sophisticated bureaucracy managed territories hundreds of miles from the capital. Royal messengers carried orders along established routes connecting major administrative centers. Most importantly, the ruler established the principle that his people's dominion meant direct control rather than merely tributary relationships. Shamshi-Adad's royal inscriptions marked another crucial development: the first systematic use of royal propaganda. Earlier, Mesopotamian rulers had certainly boasted of their achievements, but this monarch elevated self-promotion to an art form. His inscriptions carefully constructed an image of the ideal leader, pious devotee of the gods, protector of the weak, mighty warrior, and wise administrator. These themes would echo through royal ideology for over a millennium. The monarch's religious policies revealed the theological thinking that would later justify territorial expansion. Shamshi-Adad proclaimed that his patron deity had chosen him to establish justice and order throughout the world. This wasn't merely northern imperialism, it was divine mission. Foreign peoples who submitted weren't being conquered. They were being liberated from chaos and brought into the ordered realm of the gods. Yet for all his achievements, Shamshi-Adad's domain proved fragile. His death around 1781 BC triggered immediate rebellions throughout his territories. Mari broke away under its own ruler, Zimri-Lim, who expelled the conqueror's son and established an independent realm. Other conquered territories similarly reasserted their autonomy. Within a generation, control had contracted back to the immediate vicinity of the original settlement. The collapse revealed a fundamental weakness that would plague expansion efforts for centuries: the difficulty of maintaining control over vast territories with ancient communication and transportation technology. Shamshi-Adad's bureaucracy, impressive as it was, simply couldn't respond quickly enough to distant rebellions. Local governors, separated from the center by weeks of travel, inevitably developed their own agendas. More troubling still, the Northern Territory faced growing pressure from an entirely new direction. The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi created a rival directly to the south. The great lawgiver's military campaigns reached into northern Mesopotamia, threatening independence. When Hammurabi's armies finally captured Mari in 1761 BC, they systematically demolished the magnificent palace that had symbolized northern dominance. The message was unmistakable. The age of expansion was over. For nearly 4 centuries, the homeland would remain overshadowed by more formidable neighbors. But the institutions created during Shamshi-Adad's reign, the professional army, the administrative bureaucracy, the ideology of divine mission, survived this period of weakness. In the archives and temples, scribes preserved the memory of past greatness while preparing for its eventual restoration. The patron deity waited patiently on his limestone cliff, watching the caravans that still brought wealth to his domain. In the workshops below his temple, craftsmen continued producing the textiles that commanded high prices in distant markets. In the schools attached to the temple, young scribes learned to write in cuneiform and studied the ancient texts that preserved local traditions. The infrastructure of dominion endured, ready to support a new generation of leaders who would surpass even Shamshi-Adad's achievements. The early centuries had established the essential character of this northern civilization: aggressive, disciplined, religiously motivated, and commercially sophisticated. These qualities, forged in the competitive world of international commerce and refined through the first experiments in territorial expansion, would eventually enable a small trading settlement to dominate the entire ancient Near East. As the second millennium BC dawned, the homeland seemed an unlikely candidate for world dominion. Babylonian armies controlled much of Mesopotamia, while Elamite raiders threatened from the east. Egyptian pharaohs ruled a revitalized realm along the Nile, and Hittite monarchs were building a formidable empire in Anatolia. Yet hidden within the walls of the modest settlement on the Tigris, the seeds of future greatness continued to grow, nourished by the memory of past glory and the unshakable conviction that their patron deity destined his people for universal rule. The collapse of Shamshi-Adad's realm left the homeland territories in a precarious position. What had once been the center of a sprawling domain now found itself reduced to little more than a regional player, surrounded by increasingly powerful neighbors who viewed the former conquerors with suspicion and contempt. Yet within this apparent defeat lay the seeds of something far more enduring, a culture of resilience that would prove more valuable than any battlefield victory. Babylon's growing dominance cast a long shadow over Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's successors maintained their grip on the southern regions, while extending their influence toward the Tigris highlands, treating the homeland as little more than a useful buffer against threats from the Iranian plateau. Tributary payments flowed south, carrying with them the silver that had once funded expansion. The proud merchants who had established trading posts across Anatolia now found themselves subordinated to Babylonian oversight. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. A people who had believed themselves chosen by their patron deity to rule the world now served external masters. Yet rather than crushing their spirit, this humiliation forged a distinctive character trait that would define the territories for centuries: the ability to endure, adapt, and emerge stronger from adversity. They learned to bend without breaking, to preserve their essential identity while outwardly conforming to outside expectations. Local governance during this period required extraordinary diplomatic skill. Chieftains had to balance competing demands from their Babylonian overlords, their own people's expectations, and the constant threat of raids from mountain tribes. Ereshkigal II, one of the few figures whose name survived from this era, exemplified this delicate balancing act. His inscriptions speak not of conquests, but of shrine repairs, negotiated agreements, and the careful maintenance of relationships that kept his territory autonomous within the broader Babylonian sphere. The old commercial networks, though diminished, never entirely disappeared. Anatolian outposts continued operating under new arrangements, their profits now shared with Babylonian overseers. Local workshops still produced the fine textiles that commanded premium prices in distant markets. Most importantly, the expertise accumulated over centuries of international commerce remained embedded in merchant families who passed their skills from father to son, preserving capabilities that would prove crucial when opportunities for expansion returned. Sacred practices became a crucial mechanism for cultural preservation. The patron deity's shrine remained the heart of community life, its ceremonies maintaining connections to past greatness while offering hope for future restoration. Priests carefully preserved ancient texts, royal inscriptions, and ceremonial traditions that might otherwise have vanished under outside rule. These clerical scholars became the guardians of collective memory, ensuring that future generations would remember what their ancestors had achieved. The scribal schools attached to the shrine complex played an equally vital role. Young men from prominent families continued learning cuneiform writing, studying not only practical skills, but also the literary and ceremonial traditions of their homeland. They copied ancient texts, composed new works, and maintained the intellectual foundations that any future Renaissance would require. This educational infrastructure, modest though it appeared, represented an investment in capabilities that would pay enormous dividends centuries later. Martial traditions survived through more subtle means. While the professional armies of Shamshi-Adad's era had been disbanded, combat skills remained embedded in local culture. Hunting expeditions maintained familiarity with weapons and tactics. Border patrols against mountain raiders provided practical battle experience. Young men still learned the arts of war, even if they had few opportunities to practice them on a grand scale. The period of Babylonian dominance gradually gave way to an even more challenging era as new powers emerged across the region. The Mitanni, a warrior confederation centered in Syria, began expanding eastward during the 16th century BC. These skilled charioteers and horse breeders represented a fundamentally different warfare tradition from anything Mesopotamia had previously encountered. Their mobile tactics and sophisticated diplomatic networks soon brought them into conflict with established powers throughout the region. When Mitanni forces first appeared on the horizon, the homeland territories faced a stark choice: resist and face destruction, or submit and hope for favorable treatment under new masters. The local elite, drawing on decades of experience managing outside overlords, chose pragmatic accommodation. This decision, though painful, proved wise. The Mitanni focused on larger strategic objectives, allowed considerable local autonomy as long as tribute payments continued flowing and no serious resistance emerged. Under Mitanni's suzerainty, the homeland entered its darkest period. Tribute payments now flowed north to the Mitanni capital at Washukani, rather than south to Babylon. Local chieftains held even less real authority than they had under Babylonian supervision. The great networks, already diminished, contracted further as Mitanni policies favored their own commercial interests. For nearly 2 centuries, it seemed as though the territories might disappear entirely as a distinct political entity. Yet this period of apparent weakness masked important developments. The experience of serving multiple overlords had taught local elites valuable lessons about imperial organization, battlefield tactics, and diplomatic manipulation. They observed how the Mitanni maintained dominion over diverse populations, how they balanced competing interests among vassals, and how they projected authority across vast distances. These lessons, carefully absorbed and remembered, would later inform their own imperial practices. The merchant families, who formed the backbone of economic continuity, developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for maintaining their commercial empires despite political upheaval. The House of Puzur-Ishtar, whose archives survived in fragmentary form, exemplifies these survival tactics. When Babylonian overseers demanded detailed records of all transactions, the family established parallel accounting systems, one set of tablets for official inspection, another hidden archive documenting their actual operations. This dual record system allowed them to comply with oversight while protecting their most valuable secrets. These merchant dynasties cultivated relationships across multiple political boundaries, creating insurance against any single regime's collapse. The same family might maintain partners in Babylonian territories, Mitanni domains, and independent regions, allowing them to redirect their operations when political circumstances shifted. During periods of heightened tension between major powers, these commercial networks sometimes provided the only reliable channels of communication between hostile courts. The preservation of technical expertise represented another crucial survival strategy. Master craftsmen in metalworking, textile production, and weapon manufacturing passed their skills through carefully guarded apprenticeship systems. The formulae for bronze alloys, the techniques for producing the fine textiles that commanded premium prices in distant markets, and the secrets of advanced siege engine construction survived in workshops that outwardly appeared to serve only local needs. Scribal education evolved into something approaching a parallel university system. The shrine schools maintained not only basic literacy training, but sophisticated curricula covering mathematics, astronomy, law, history, and tactical theory. Young scribes studied geometric principles needed for siege warfare, astronomical calculations required for accurate campaign timing, and legal precedents that would govern future territorial management. These educational institutions produced graduates whose capabilities far exceeded what their current subordinate status might suggest. The relationship with Kassite Babylonia grew increasingly complex, as both powers recognized their mutual dependence despite underlying tensions. The Kassites, originally mountain peoples who had established dominion over southern Mesopotamia following the Hittite raid that ended Hammurabi's dynasty, lacked the deep organizational traditions of their predecessors. They relied heavily on expertise from the north in commercial law, diplomatic protocol, and engineering. This dependence created opportunities for subtle influence. Advisors in Kassite courts carefully promoted policies favorable to their homeland while appearing to serve their master's interests loyally. Commercial agreements negotiated by these advisors often included provisions that strengthened positions for the northern territories. Consulting contracts allowed experts to study Kassite defensive systems while ostensibly helping to improve them. The Kassite rulers themselves recognized the delicate nature of this relationship. Kurigalzu the Firm established a formal protocol governing interactions with the homeland that acknowledged its special status within the Babylonian sphere. Unlike other vassals, who were governed through appointed overseers, the territories retained their traditional chieftains under a system of supervised autonomy. This arrangement reflected Kassite recognition that heavy-handed supervision might provoke resistance they were ill-equipped to suppress. Sacred developments during this era laid crucial foundations for future imperial ideology. Shrine scholars developed increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks that would later justify universal conquest. The concept of divine order became central to these theological developments. Their patron deity represented cosmic justice and rational governance, while outside rule represented chaos and oppression that must eventually be corrected. These theological innovations went far beyond simple nationalism. Scholars developed detailed arguments explaining why their deity's dominion should extend over all peoples and territories. Foreign gods weren't necessarily false, according to this theology, but they were subordinate deities who properly served under the supreme divine authority. This framework would later allow conquered peoples to maintain their practices while acknowledging political supremacy from the north. The preservation of warfare expertise involved more than simply maintaining theoretical texts. Veterans of Shamshi-Adad's campaigns, though aging, passed practical experience to younger generations through hunting expeditions that were actually combat training exercises in disguise. These expeditions taught battlefield communication, unit coordination, logistics management, and command skills under the cover of pursuing wild game in the mountains. Border conflicts with mountain tribes provided additional opportunities for practical education in warfare. These skirmishes, though small in scale, offered invaluable experience in assault tactics, cavalry operations, and the integration of different troop types. Young men who distinguished themselves in these conflicts were quietly identified as potential commanders and given additional training in staff work and strategic planning. The development of what would later become the most advanced siege techniques in the ancient world began during this period of apparent weakness. Engineers working on civilian construction projects, shrine renovations, city wall maintenance, irrigation system repairs, secretly applied their skills to battlefield problems. How could existing fortifications be most efficiently breached? What materials and tools would be required? How could assault equipment be rapidly constructed and deployed? Intelligence gathering became another area of systematic development. The commercial networks that maintained contact throughout the region also provided channels for collecting information about rival capabilities, political developments, and economic conditions. Merchants returning from expeditions were systematically debriefed about everything they had observed: troop movements, fortress construction, population changes, and policies. This intelligence system gradually evolved into something approaching a professional espionage network. Certain merchant families specialized in information gathering, developing techniques for extracting sensitive information from contacts, establishing secure communication channels, and maintaining cover identities that allowed deep penetration of societies. These capabilities would prove invaluable when active expansion resumed. Ashur III emerged during the most difficult years of Mitanni dominance as a figure who understood both the constraints of the current situation and the possibilities it might eventually offer. Rather than attempting futile resistance, he focused on strengthening internal institutions, renovating shrines, supporting scribal schools, and maintaining the commercial relationships that provided the territory's economic foundation. His patient approach reflected a sophisticated understanding that true independence would require careful preparation rather than dramatic gestures. The gradual weakening of Mitanni supervision created new opportunities for ambitious local figures. Internal conflicts within the Mitanni Confederation, pressure from the rising Hittite realm to the west, and Egyptian interference in Syrian affairs all combined to reduce the effectiveness of oversight from the north. Local chieftains found themselves with increasing freedom to pursue their own policies, though they remained careful to maintain the appearance of loyal vassalage. Business relationships proved crucial during this transition. Merchants who had maintained connections throughout the dark years now found their services in high demand as regional powers sought reliable commercial partners. The silver trade, though much reduced from its earlier scale, still provided significant revenues. More importantly, commercial relationships offered channels for diplomatic communication and intelligence gathering that would prove invaluable when political circumstances changed. The preservation of tactical expertise during these centuries of enforced peace represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of all. Hunting traditions maintained familiarity with weapons and battlefield techniques. Veterans of border conflicts passed their experience to younger generations through informal networks. Most importantly, warfare literature, tactical manuals, assault techniques, and organizational procedures survived in shrine archives, ready to be consulted when opportunities for their application returned. The gradual erosion of Mitanni supervision created opportunities for testing these carefully preserved capabilities. Local conflicts escalated in scope and sophistication as commanders applied theoretical insights gained during the long period of enforced peace. These campaigns, though limited in geographic scope, served as practical laboratories for developing the combined arms tactics that would later prove so devastatingly effective against much larger enemies. Organizational innovations during this period focused on creating systems capable of rapid expansion when opportunities arose. Local government was restructured along lines that could easily be scaled up to manage much larger territories. Record-keeping systems were standardized to facilitate integration of conquered regions. Communication networks were established that could handle the message traffic required by a major territorial power. Perhaps most importantly, the elite class that emerged during this period had been thoroughly educated in the realities of international politics. Unlike their ancestors, who had learned statecraft through trial and error, these men understood from careful observation exactly how empires maintained dominion over diverse populations. They had studied Babylonian organizational techniques, Mitanni battlefield organization, and Egyptian diplomatic protocols with the systematic attention of students preparing for examinations. The economic foundations for future expansion were carefully maintained despite the constraints of outside oversight. Silver reserves, though much reduced from their earlier levels, were systematically accumulated through careful management of profits. Strategic materials, iron for weapons, timber for assault engines, horses for cavalry, were stockpiled under the cover of legitimate commercial activities. Most importantly, the credit networks that would be essential for financing major campaigns were preserved and gradually expanded. Cultural developments during this era reflected the complex balance between preserving distinct identity and adapting to changing circumstances. Artistic styles incorporated outside influences while maintaining recognizable local characteristics. Literary traditions evolved to include new genres, historical texts that preserved memories of past greatness, legal treatises that codified principles of just governance, and tactical manuals that synthesized practical experience with theoretical analysis. The concept of professional service began taking shape during these centuries of apparent peace. Young men from prominent families were systematically trained not just in combat skills, but in the broader capabilities required for command: engineering, logistics, organization, and diplomacy. This educational system produced a cadre of potential officers whose capabilities far exceeded what their current circumstances might suggest. By the 14th century BC, careful observers could detect unmistakable signs that the long period of subordination was approaching its end. Mitanni supervision had grown increasingly erratic as internal conflicts weakened the confederation. Babylonian authority, focused on southern affairs, barely extended into the homeland territories. Egyptian influence, concentrated on Syrian and Palestinian concerns, created opportunities rather than constraints. Local chieftains began testing the boundaries of their autonomy with increasing boldness. Shrine construction projects grew more ambitious, units expanded beyond defensive requirements, and diplomatic contacts multiplied far beyond what oversight might approve. Most tellingly, royal inscriptions began adopting language that implied divine sanction for increasingly independent policies. The stage was set for a dramatic transformation that would reshape the entire ancient world. Centuries of patient endurance had preserved every essential element of identity, while allowing the systematic absorption of useful innovations from various overlords. The commercial networks that had once funded Shamshi-Adad's expansion remained intact and strengthened, ready to support ventures of unprecedented scope. Tactical expertise, refined through theoretical study and practical application in limited conflicts, had evolved far beyond its earlier forms. Organizational capabilities, tested through managing complex relationships with multiple overlords, were prepared for challenges of continental scale. Most importantly, the conviction that their patron deity intended his people to dominate the world burned more brightly than ever, tempered by hard-won wisdom but undimmed by temporary setbacks. The long apprenticeship in survival was about to end. The age of universal dominion was about to begin. The moment of liberation came with stunning suddenness. Ashurbanipal ascended the throne around 1363 BC to find the international order that had constrained his people for centuries suddenly collapsing around him. The Mitanni Confederation, weakened by internal strife and Hittite pressure, could no longer maintain effective oversight of its eastern territories. For the first time in nearly half a millennium, the homeland faced no overwhelming external authority demanding submission. Ashurbanipal seized this opportunity with the calculated boldness of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for such a moment. His first act was to assert prerogatives that no ruler had dared claim since Shamshi-Adad's death. He took the ancient title Great King, placing himself on equal footing with the pharaohs of Egypt and the lords of southern Mesopotamia. This wasn't mere pretension. It was a declaration of independence that reverberated throughout the diplomatic circles of the ancient world. The Amarna letters, discovered in the Egyptian archives, preserve correspondence between this northern leader and Pharaoh Amenhotep III that reveals the dramatic transformation taking place. The letters discuss marriages between their houses, gift exchanges, and mutual assistance against common enemies. Egypt, the greatest power of the age, was treating the homeland as a legitimate participant in international politics rather than a subordinate entity. When the letter proclaimed, "I am a great king, your brother," the pharaoh did not dispute the claim. This diplomatic recognition provided the foundation for something far more ambitious than mere independence. The northern ruler understood that survival in the volatile world of 14th century politics required not just autonomy, but the ability to project power beyond his own borders. The Mitanni collapse had created a vacuum in northern Mesopotamia that would inevitably be filled by someone. He intended to ensure that someone was himself. The transformation of the homeland's capabilities proceeded with remarkable speed. Iron technology, still relatively new in the 14th century BC, gave the emerging state a crucial advantage over enemies still relying primarily on bronze weapons. The mountains north of the homeland contained rich iron deposits, and local smiths had quietly mastered the complex metallurgical processes required to produce superior steel. These iron weapons held sharper edges, maintained their effectiveness longer, and could penetrate armor that had previously been considered impregnable. The first major test came with intervention in southern Mesopotamian politics. The Kassite dynasty ruling Babylon was experiencing a succession crisis, with rival claimants fighting for the throne. The northern leader backed one contender with both diplomatic support and armed assistance. When his candidate, Kurigalzu II, gained the southern throne, the intervention succeeded beyond all expectations. More importantly, it demonstrated that the homeland had regained the capacity for decisive action beyond its borders. Enlil-Nirari, the successor, continued the expansion with systematic operations that pushed deeper into former Mitanni territories. These were not mere raids for plunder, but deliberate offensives designed to incorporate new regions into a growing territorial state. Each victory brought not only immediate gains in wealth and resources, but also valuable experience in the complex challenges of governing diverse populations. The legal innovations that emerged during this period would influence jurisprudence throughout the ancient world for centuries to come. The Middle Assyrian law code represented one of the most comprehensive and systematic legal documents ever created, addressing every aspect of social behavior with unprecedented harshness and detail. Unlike earlier collections that focused primarily on commercial disputes, this code regulated family relationships, property rights, criminal behavior, and social obligations with surgical precision. The laws revealed a society organized around strict hierarchies and absolute sovereign authority. A noble who killed a commoner faced a fine. A commoner who struck a noble faced execution. Women accused of adultery underwent trial by ordeal, thrown into a river to determine guilt or innocence through divine judgment. Theft of state property carried the death penalty, while theft from private citizens might be resolved through compensation. The code's 200-plus provisions covered everything, from inheritance disputes to agricultural contracts, from marriage arrangements to battlefield conduct. What made these laws revolutionary was their systematic organization and universal application throughout the growing state. Previous legal traditions had been collections of precedents applied inconsistently depending on local circumstances. The new code established uniform standards that created legal unity transcending regional differences. Judges carried copies of the code to distant regions, ensuring that the same principles governed behavior from the capital to the furthest frontier. The harshness of many penalties served multiple purposes beyond simple deterrence. Public executions, mutilations, and other severe punishments reinforced sovereign authority while demonstrating the consequences of challenging established order. A man who raped a virgin faced castration. A woman who procured an abortion faced impalement. These spectacles served important psychological functions in a warrior society where displays of strength and ruthlessness were essential components of political legitimacy. Adad-Nirari I, who ruled from approximately 1305 to 1274 BC, transformed these early achievements into the foundation of a true territorial state. His operations extended dominion deep into Syria, bringing the realm into direct confrontation with both Egyptian and Hittite interests in the region. His inscriptions boast of overrunning 60 cities and crossing the Euphrates multiple times in pursuit of enemies who fled like birds. The systematic population transfer policies that would later become synonymous with northern expansion began during Adad-Nirari's reign. After capturing enemy cities, his armies forcibly relocated entire populations to distant parts of the growing realm. The city of Taidu alone yielded 28,800 captives who were resettled in agricultural colonies throughout the homeland. These transfers served multiple strategic purposes. They prevented rebellion by separating people from their traditional territories, provided labor for agricultural and building projects, and created ethnically mixed populations less likely to unite against central authority. The engineering capabilities that enabled these operations became legendary throughout the ancient Near East. Assault techniques developed during this period revolutionized warfare across the entire region. Engineers constructed massive earth ramps that allowed assault troops to reach the tops of city walls that had previously been considered impregnable. Battering rams weighing several tons, protected by mobile wooden shields, concentrated enormous force against gates and weak points in fortifications. Most innovative were the assault towers, multi-story wooden structures mounted on wheels that could be pushed against enemy walls. These towers, some reaching heights of 30 meters, allowed attackers to fight from elevated positions while protecting assault troops from defender arrows. The largest towers required teams of 200 men to maneuver and contained multiple levels for archers, assault troops, and command personnel. The logistical systems supporting these operations represented genuine innovations in the art of warfare. Supply trains carried not only food and weapons, but also the specialized materials and tools necessary for building assault equipment on site. Each major operation included dedicated units of engineers, carpenters, metal workers, and rope makers who could build whatever equipment the tactical situation might require. Standardized components, prefabricated in the homeland, could be assembled quickly at battle sites. Shalmaneser I continued his father's aggressive expansion with operations that brought the realm to unprecedented territorial extent. His armies pushed north into the Armenian highlands, securing access to metal resources and establishing fortress cities to control mountain passes. Western operations reached the approaches to the Mediterranean, while southern offensives threatened the approaches to the great southern cities. His inscriptions claim the subjugation of 51 cities and the relocation of 180,000 captives during his 30-year reign. The governmental systems developed to oversee these territories represented genuine innovations in statecraft. Unlike earlier realms that had relied primarily on tributary relationships with local rulers, the new state established direct oversight through appointed governors responsible to the central government. These regional officials, drawn primarily from the homeland's nobility, were rotated regularly to prevent them from developing independent power bases. Each region was required to provide standardized payments, calculated according to agricultural productivity and population. Grain, livestock, textiles, metals, and manufactured goods flowed steadily toward the capital, while specialized products, purple dye from coastal cities, incense from desert regions, timber from mountain forests, supplied the sovereign workshops. Payment records preserved in the palace archives document the enormous wealth these regions generated annually. Communication networks linking distant regions to the capital became marvels of ancient engineering. State roads were built according to standardized specifications, with way stations positioned at 30-kilometer intervals to provide fresh horses and supplies for messengers. This system enabled the central government to receive reports from regions 500 kilometers away and transmit orders in return within 2 weeks, unprecedented speed for ancient communications. The crown jewel of this expanding realm came with the great southern city's fall around 1225 BC. This ancient metropolis, the cultural and religious heart of southern Mesopotamia, had dominated the region for over a millennium. Its fall to northern armies marked a symbolic transformation that reverberated throughout the ancient world. For the first time, the homeland commanded territories stretching from the Armenian mountains to the Persian Gulf. The operation against the southern metropolis required 7 years of systematic warfare that tested every aspect of the realm's capabilities. Intelligence networks had gathered detailed information about the city's defenses, revealing weak points in its massive walls. Diplomatic efforts isolated the target from potential allies, while securing neutrality from neighboring powers. Most importantly, the operation demonstrated the realm's capacity for sustained warfare, requiring enormous logistical coordination. When the great city finally fell, the victor's treatment of the prize revealed the sophisticated ideology that had evolved since earlier times. Rather than destroying the metropolis, he ordered its reconstruction according to his own specifications, while preserving its essential character. New temples honored both traditional southern deities and the patron deity of the north. Official buildings reflected northern architectural styles, while incorporating local decorative elements. Most significantly, the conqueror assumed the traditional titles of southern leadership: King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters, King of all peoples. He presented himself as the legitimate successor to ancient dynasties rather than a foreign invader. This represented a crucial evolution in thinking, the recognition that lasting dominion required cultural as well as armed victory. The palace reliefs commissioned during this period provide remarkable insights into the ideology justifying these operations. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian art that had focused primarily on religious themes, these works celebrated military victory and state power with unprecedented explicitness. Scenes depicted assault warfare in minute detail, attack towers approaching city walls, defenders falling from battlements, prisoners being led away in chains. The famous White Obelisk contained the most comprehensive account of achievements ever created up to that time. Its 4 sides displayed relief carvings showing representatives from dozens of subjected territories, presenting exotic goods to the enthroned leader. Accompanying inscriptions listed military victories, building projects, and religious dedications that emphasized the universal scope of authority. The King of Kings ideology that emerged during this period would influence thinking throughout the ancient world for centuries to come. Official inscriptions proclaimed that the patron deity had granted universal dominion to his chosen representative on earth. Foreign rulers were not independent sovereigns, but subordinate governors who derived their authority from the supreme leader. This theological framework justified expansion, while providing mechanisms for incorporating defeated enemies into the governmental hierarchy. Economic policies implemented during this period created the fiscal foundations for sustained expansion. Payment systems were standardized across all regions, with assessments calculated according to detailed surveys of agricultural productivity and population. The sovereign workshops produced luxury goods for both domestic consumption and international trade, while state-controlled mines extracted precious metals that funded operations. The population transfer policies that had begun under Adad-Nirari, the first reached industrial scale during the southern metropolis operation. Official inscriptions claim the relocation of over 300,000 people during this reign, with entire cities evacuated and their populations resettled in agricultural colonies throughout the realm. These demographic transfers served multiple strategic purposes, while providing the labor force necessary for ambitious building projects. The cultural programs initiated during this period reflected the confidence of a ruler who believed his realm would endure forever. He commissioned the copying of ancient texts from southern libraries, ensuring that the literary heritage of Mesopotamia would be preserved in state archives. Scholars from subjected territories were brought to the capital to serve in the sovereign library, where they produced new works celebrating achievements while maintaining traditional scholarly disciplines. The great palace complex built during this period rivaled anything in the ancient world. Its throne room could accommodate over 1,000 visitors, while its archives contained more than 14,000 cuneiform tablets documenting every aspect of state operations. Wall reliefs depicted representatives from territories stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, emphasizing the universal scope of authority. Yet beneath this impressive facade, serious structural problems were beginning to emerge. The realm's rapid expansion had created challenges that strained existing institutional capabilities. Governing territories stretching from Armenia to the southern cities required resources and expertise that even the most successful operations could not indefinitely provide. The constant warfare necessary to maintain territorial sovereignty consumed enormous quantities of wealth and manpower. Cultural tensions created by ruling diverse populations with different languages, customs, and religious traditions generated persistent resistance. The policy of direct oversight through appointed governors created resentment among subjected elites who had previously enjoyed local autonomy. Population transfer programs, designed to prevent rebellion by mixing ethnic groups, created new problems by separating people from their traditional support networks. The emergence of Aramean tribal confederations along the realm's western borders presented challenges that traditional solutions could not easily address. These nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples possessed mobility that allowed them to strike at vulnerable targets and withdraw before organized retaliation could be mounted. Their decentralized political structures meant that defeating one group provided no guarantee against attacks by others. Aramean raids intensified throughout the late 13th century BC, targeting the agricultural settlements that provided the realm's economic foundation. Unlike previous enemies who fought pitched battles that favored northern advantages in assault warfare and heavy infantry, these tribal confederations employed hit-and-run tactics that neutralized technological superiority. Their knowledge of local terrain allowed them to appear suddenly, devastate settlements, and disappear into desert or mountain refuges. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. Agricultural populations throughout the western regions began abandoning their settlements for fortified cities, reducing agricultural productivity and increasing the burden on state resources. Trade routes that had previously generated substantial revenues became too dangerous for merchant caravans, disrupting the commercial networks that had partially funded expansion. Internal succession disputes further weakened the realm's capacity to respond effectively to these mounting challenges. The great conqueror's assassination by his own son around 1207 BC triggered a period of civil conflict that allowed several subjected territories to reassert their independence. The southern regions, never fully reconciled to northern rule, were among the first to break away under the leadership of Adad Shuma Usur. The reigns of subsequent rulers saw desperate attempts to restore power through renewed operations. Some temporary successes were achieved. Territories were re-subjugated, enemies defeated, payments resumed. However, these victories proved increasingly difficult to sustain as the fundamental problems of overextension remained unresolved. Economic difficulties compounded these political and military challenges. The payment system that had funded expansion began generating diminishing returns as regions struggled with the combined burdens of taxation, population transfers, and constant warfare. Agricultural productivity declined throughout the realm as farmers abandoned their fields for fortified cities or were forcibly relocated to unfamiliar territories. The great building projects that had symbolized power became impossible to complete as resources were diverted to urgent defensive needs. The magnificent palace complex begun by the great conqueror remained unfinished, its partially completed walls a monument to vanished ambitions. Religious building ceased entirely as revenues that had previously funded sacred projects were redirected toward increasingly expensive operations. By 1050 BC, the great experiment in territorial dominion that had begun so promisingly 3 centuries earlier had largely collapsed. State authority contracted to roughly the same boundaries the homeland had held when the expansion began. The magnificent palaces and temples stood as monuments to vanished greatness, their archives preserving the records of victories that could no longer be maintained. Yet the 3 centuries of expansion had achieved transformations that would influence the entire future course of Near Eastern history. The governmental techniques, engineering innovations, and ideologies developed during this period had been tested on a continental scale. The lessons learned from both successes and failures provided invaluable guidance for future attempts at empire building. The legal code promulgated during this period established principles of governance that survived the collapse of the state that created them. Regional oversight systems pioneered during this era provided models for later organizations. Most importantly, the homeland had demonstrated that universal dominion was not merely a theoretical possibility, but an achievable goal for any power possessing sufficient resources, organization, and determination. In the archives and temples of the capital, scribes continued copying the texts that preserved the memory of past achievements, while preparing for their eventual restoration. The patron deity waited in his enlarged temple, surrounded by the spoils of victory and the promises of future glory. The homeland that had once ruled from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf would rise again, more powerful and more terrible than ever before. The age of universal dominion had been postponed, not abandoned. Resurrection began in darkness. For over a century, the homeland had endured its second great humiliation, reduced once again to a shadow of former greatness, harassed by Aramean raiders and dismissed by neighboring powers as a spent force. Magnificent palaces built by earlier conquerors stood partially ruined, their archives gathering dust while weeds grew through cracked foundations. Yet within this apparent decay, something extraordinary was taking shape. Adad-nirari II ascended the throne in 911 BC to find a state barely larger than the original settlement that had emerged from Mitanti collapse centuries earlier. Aramean tribes who had contributed so heavily to the previous collapse now occupied territories that had once paid homage to his ancestors. Trade routes lay disrupted, agricultural settlements remained abandoned, and the very survival of the kingdom seemed uncertain. What this new leader possessed, however, was something his predecessors had lacked: accumulated wisdom from previous failures. Lessons learned from the Middle Period's collapse had been carefully preserved in temple archives and passed down through generations of scholars. Causes of defeat were well understood: overextension without adequate communication networks, cultural resistance from inadequately integrated populations, economic dependence on constant warfare, and vulnerability to mobile enemies who refused to fight conventional battles. This new generation of leaders had studied these problems systematically and developed solutions that would transform the nature of ancient combat forever. Innovations that emerged during Adad-Nirari's reign represented a fundamental revolution in warfare doctrine. Previous forces had relied primarily on infantry, supported by chariots, formations effective in pitched battles, but poorly suited to pursuing mobile enemies or maintaining control over vast territories. His new approach integrated cavalry units that could match Aramean mobility while retaining the disciplinary advantages of professional forces. These mounted units were not merely infantry on horseback, but specialized troops trained specifically for mounted combat. Riders developed techniques for shooting arrows accurately while controlling their horses at full gallop, enabling them to engage enemies who had previously been able to attack and withdraw without facing retaliation. More importantly, cavalry forces could pursue fleeing enemies across any terrain, turning tactical victories into strategic triumphs by preventing defeated forces from regrouping. Horse breeding programs that supported these innovations required decades of careful development. Northern territories contained excellent grazing lands and systematic efforts to improve local horse stocks through selective breeding and importation of superior animals. From Central Asian peoples gradually produced mounts capable of carrying armored riders across hundreds of kilometers without exhaustion. These animals became so valuable that capturing enemy horses became a primary objective of many operations. Iron technology reached full maturity during this period, providing overwhelming advantages over enemies still relying on bronze weapons and tools. Metallurgical expertise developed over previous centuries now enabled smiths to produce steel of extraordinary quality, swords that could cut through bronze armor, spearheads that could penetrate any shield, and arrowheads that rendered traditional defensive equipment obsolete. More importantly, iron tools enabled engineering projects on scales previously impossible. Assault warfare capabilities that had made the Middle Period famous were systematically enhanced through both technological and tactical innovations. Engineers developed new designs for battering rams that could breach the strongest walls, attack towers that could overtop any fortification, and earth-moving techniques that enabled the construction of assault ramps in a fraction of the time previously required. Standardized components, manufactured in homeland workshops, could be rapidly assembled at battle sites according to detailed technical manuals. Most revolutionary was development of specialized artillery, mechanical devices that could hurl large stones with devastating accuracy against specific targets. These machines, operated by trained crews who understood the mathematical principles governing projectile motion, could systematically destroy defensive barriers from distances that kept operators safe from enemy arrows. Psychological impact of watching massive stones smash through supposedly impregnable fortifications often proved as important as physical damage inflicted. Tukulti-Ninurta II continued his father's reforms while adding crucial innovations in logistics and communication. Professional forces that were emerging required supply systems far more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. Operations lasting months or years across thousands of kilometers demanded careful coordination of food, weapons, equipment, and replacement personnel. Solutions developed during this period would influence organization throughout the ancient world. Standardized equipment simplified supply requirements while improving combat effectiveness. Instead of warriors bringing their own weapons and armor according to personal preferences and financial capabilities, professional soldiers received identical gear manufactured according to specifications developed through systematic testing. This standardization meant that replacement parts could be produced in advance and transported to wherever they might be needed, while training could focus on optimal techniques for using specific equipment designs. Communication systems linking field forces to the homeland represented engineering marvels that enabled unprecedented coordination of operations. Relay stations positioned at strategic intervals could transmit messages across the entire kingdom within days rather than weeks. Signal fires, visible from station to station across mountainous terrain, could alert distant commanders to urgent developments almost instantaneously. Most importantly, detailed maps and route descriptions enabled forces operating in unfamiliar territories to coordinate their movements with precision. Ashurbanipal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC, transformed these innovations into instruments of systematic territorial growth that dwarfed anything achieved by his predecessors. His forces conducted operations across a geographic scope that stretched from the Armenian highlands to the approaches of Egypt, demonstrating capabilities that shocked contemporary powers throughout the region. More importantly, he developed policies that would enable permanent integration of conquered territories. His new capital, constructed at Kalhu during this monarch's reign, represented both a symbol of renewed power and a practical response to the challenges of governing a growing state. Unlike previous capitals that had grown organically over centuries, Kalhu was planned from the beginning as the center of a territorial power. Its palaces contained facilities for housing foreign diplomats. Its archives were designed to manage correspondence from dozens of distant regions, and its workshops could produce luxury goods necessary for maintaining relationships with allied and subject peoples. A throne room in this palace became one of the ancient world's most impressive displays of royal power. Its walls were covered with relief sculptures depicting the ruler's victories in minute detail, assault operations, enemy surrenders, tribute presentations, and hunting expeditions that demonstrated royal prowess. These images served multiple audiences. Foreign visitors could observe consequences of resistance, while domestic viewers were reminded of their sovereign's divine favor and capabilities. An inaugural banquet held to celebrate the palace's completion brought together 69,574 guests from across the known world, a logistical achievement that demonstrated organizational capabilities as impressive as any victory. For 10 days, royal kitchens provided food and drink for this enormous gathering, while entertainment included musical performances, athletic competitions, and ceremonial presentations that showcased the cultural sophistication of the expanding kingdom. Systematic use of terror as a political instrument reached new levels of sophistication during this reign. Unlike previous rulers who had employed brutal punishments primarily in response to specific acts of resistance, Ashurbanipal's approach made terror a deliberate component of strategy. Detailed accounts of punishments inflicted on resistors were widely circulated, creating psychological pressure that often made actual violence unnecessary. His famous standard inscription, copied throughout the territories, describes the fate awaiting those who challenged royal authority with graphic precision. I flayed many troops and covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. These descriptions were not mere boasts, but calculated psychological warfare designed to encourage submission without requiring costly assault operations. Deportation policies pioneered during the Middle Period were refined into systematic programs for reshaping the demographic composition of conquered territories. Entire populations were relocated not randomly, but according to carefully planned strategies designed to maximize both economic productivity and political stability. Skilled craftsmen were concentrated in areas where their expertise was most needed, while potential troublemakers were dispersed among populations unlikely to support resistance movements. These population transfers operated on scales that transformed the ethnic composition of entire regions. During this reign alone, royal inscriptions document the relocation of over 200,000 people from their ancestral territories to new settlements throughout the growing state. Unlike earlier deportations that had often been hasty responses to immediate needs, these transfers were planned years in advance and executed with systematic precision. Shalmaneser III, who inherited the throne in 858 BC and ruled for 35 years, presided over a state positioned to challenge every major power in the ancient Near East. His long reign saw operations that brought forces into contact with peoples from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, while diplomatic relationships extended even further. More importantly, his era witnessed development of policies that would enable the integration of this vast territorial expanse into a functioning political entity. Western operations that dominated much of this long reign brought forces into sustained conflict with coalitions of Syrian and Palestinian cities that were determined to prevent northern growth toward the Mediterranean. These enemies possessed advantages that had previously proved decisive against Mesopotamian forces: intimate knowledge of local terrain, secure bases in mountainous regions, and access to Egyptian support. Yet northern forces eventually prevailed despite these disadvantages, demonstrating how completely combat capabilities had been transformed. At the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC, northern forces confronted the largest coalition ever assembled against territorial growth. Allied forces included troops from Damascus, Israel, Egypt, and a dozen smaller states, while its 70,000 soldiers represented nearly every tradition in the region. Royal inscriptions claim a decisive victory, though the coalition's ability to reassemble and continue resistance suggests the outcome was less conclusive than official accounts suggested. More significant than any single battle was systematic reduction of fortified cities that had previously been considered impregnable. Assault on Damascus required 3 years of continuous operations, while capture of smaller but strategically important cities demonstrated capabilities that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Enemies who had confidently relied on their fortifications found themselves facing techniques against which no existing defenses provided adequate protection. Shalmaneser's famous Black Obelisk, erected during this reign, provides remarkable insights into the scope and character of territorial growth during this period. Its relief carvings depict representatives from territories stretching across the entire known world, while its inscriptions document operations conducted across distances that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Most significantly, it shows Jehu of Israel prostrating himself before the northern ruler, the earliest known artistic depiction of a biblical figure. A payment system that emerged during this period represented a sophisticated balance between extracting wealth from subject territories and maintaining their long-term productive capacity. Unlike earlier approaches that had often reduced conquered regions to economic exhaustion through excessive demands, this new system was calibrated to encourage prosperity that could be systematically harvested. Regional economies were encouraged to specialize in products that commanded high values in international markets. Phoenician cities that submitted during this period illustrate how this system operated in practice. Rather than being stripped of their wealth through one-time extractions, these maritime trading centers were encouraged to expand their commercial networks while contributing fixed percentages of their income to the central treasury. This approach generated far more wealth over time while creating powerful incentives for collaboration rather than resistance. Development of Urartu as a major rival during the later years presented challenges that tested every aspect of the growing state's capabilities. This highland confederation, centered in the Armenian mountains, possessed technologies comparable to those of the northern forces, while enjoying defensive advantages that made direct subjugation extremely difficult. Resulting competition forced innovations in organization, diplomatic strategy, and economic policy that would influence development for centuries. Urartian challenge differed fundamentally from earlier enemies who had relied primarily on static defenses or mobile raiding tactics. These highlanders possessed sophisticated metallurgical capabilities, extensive trade networks, and political institutions that enabled sustained resistance against even the most determined assault operations. Their fortress cities, constructed on mountain peaks and supplied through elaborate engineering works, required techniques specifically adapted to high-altitude conditions. More troubling was Urartu's ability to challenge northern influence among traditional allies and tributaries. Highland Confederation offered an alternative model of regional organization that appealed to peoples who had grown weary of deportations and payment demands associated with northern dominion. Competition for influence among borderland populations forced development of more sophisticated approaches to maintaining loyalty among subject peoples. Temporary stagnation that characterized the final years reflected enormous challenges involved in governing territories that now stretched across multiple climatic zones, cultural regions, and linguistic groups. Systems that had proved adequate for managing earlier territorial gains were overwhelmed by the complexity of coordinating policies across such vast distances and diverse populations. Communication delays that had been manageable when the state encompassed only northern Mesopotamia became serious obstacles to effective governance when forces operated simultaneously in Armenia, Syria, and southern Iraq. Orders issued from the capital might become obsolete before reaching their destinations, while reports from distant regions often described situations that had changed dramatically by the time they were received. Economic strains also became apparent as costs of maintaining forces across such extensive territories began to exceed the income they generated. Assault operations required to reduce major fortress cities consumed enormous quantities of resources while producing relatively modest, immediate returns. Success in these operations often required years of sustained effort that tied down units that might otherwise have been available for more profitable ventures. Succession of Shamshi-Adad, the fifth in 823 BC, marked the beginning of a period when internal challenges temporarily overshadowed external growth. A civil war lasting 6 years saw the state's territories choosing sides between competing claimants to the throne, while neighboring powers seized opportunities to reclaim territories lost during earlier operations. Ultimate victory preserved territorial integrity, but at costs that required decades to recover. Lessons learned during this crisis led to important innovations in governmental organization and succession planning. Practice of associating crown princes with operations while they were still young ensured that future leaders would possess practical experience in the challenges of managing vast territories. More importantly, development of institutional mechanisms for managing succession disputes reduced the likelihood that future transitions would trigger similar civil conflicts. Reforms implemented during Shamshi-Adad, the fifth's reign, addressed many of the organizational problems that had become apparent during his father's later years. Regional system was restructured to create smaller, more manageable units that could be supervised more effectively from the center. Communication networks were expanded and systematized to ensure more reliable coordination between distant regions and the central government. By 745 BC, when this phase of growth reached its conclusion, the northern state had been transformed beyond recognition. What had begun as a modest settlement controlling the immediate vicinity of an ancient trading center now encompassed territories stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. More importantly, innovations developed during this period had created capabilities that would enable even more ambitious ventures. Lessons learned from both successes and failures during this era provided invaluable guidance for future efforts. Importance of systematic communication networks, carefully calibrated payment policies, and sophisticated approaches to managing cultural diversity had all been demonstrated through practical experience. Most importantly, the state had proved that sustained growth across continental distances was not only possible, but could be made to generate resources necessary for further development. Now the stage was set for achievements that would dwarf even these remarkable accomplishments. A machine forged during these centuries of revival would soon be directed by leaders whose ambitions encompassed not merely regional dominance, but universal sovereignty. An age of systematic conquest was about to begin, and the entire ancient world would feel its impact. Transformation came like lightning across a darkened sky. In 745 BC, a usurper seized the throne, and within a single generation had created the most formidable war machine the ancient world had ever witnessed. What had taken previous dynasties centuries to accomplish, this new lineage achieved in decades. A northern kingdom that had struggled to maintain regional influence would soon command domains stretching from the Nile cataracts to the Iranian plateau, from the Black Sea to the Arabian desert. Revolutionary change arrived through violence, as this usurper overthrew the legitimate heir in a palace coup that left the previous dynasty extinct. Yet this act of treachery proved to be ancient history's most consequential crime, for it brought to the throne a strategic genius whose reforms would reshape not only his own realm, but the entire concept of how dominions could be organized and controlled. Where previous rulers had been content with temporary dominance, this new monarch envisioned permanent transformation of the known world. Sweeping changes he initiated addressed every weakness that had plagued earlier expansion efforts. Regional systems, inherited from his predecessors, had proven vulnerable to local strongmen who accumulated power in distant areas, eventually challenging central authority or simply withholding resources. His solution was radical. Instead of governing through traditional local elites or appointed governors drawn from the homeland's nobility, he created a professional cadre answerable only to the crown. These new officials possessed no hereditary claims to authority and owed their positions entirely to royal favor. More importantly, they were rotated frequently between different assignments, preventing them from developing the local relationships that had enabled previous governors to build independent power bases. A man who served in Syria one year might find himself managing districts in Armenia the next, ensuring that his loyalties remained focused on the central court rather than regional interests. Fiscal systems implemented under this reformed structure generated unprecedented revenues while reducing the burden on the central apparatus. Instead of negotiating tribute payments with individual cities or areas according to their specific circumstances, standardized assessments were imposed based on systematic surveys of agricultural productivity, population, and commercial activity. These surveys, conducted by teams of professional accountants and engineers, provided detailed information about economic conditions throughout the expanding dominions. Road construction programs undertaken during this period created infrastructure necessary for effective oversight across continental distances. Unlike communication networks established by earlier rulers, which had focused primarily on enabling rapid transmission of messages, these new routes were designed to support movement of large forces, commercial caravans, and official personnel. Standardized bridges, rest stations, and supply depots enabled travel across the entire territorial expanse with unprecedented speed and reliability. Standing forces created during this revolutionary reign represented a complete departure from traditional approaches to organizing combat power. Previous rulers had relied primarily on seasonal levies, supplemented by professional corps units, an arrangement that limited duration and scope of possible operations. This new system maintained large numbers of full-time soldiers who could be deployed anywhere within the realm without regard to agricultural cycles or local recruitment needs. Professional fighters received standardized training, equipment, and compensation that created capabilities far exceeding anything achieved by part-time forces. Specialized units developed expertise in specific combat roles: heavy infantry for assault operations, light troops for reconnaissance and pursuit, engineers for construction and destruction projects, cavalry for rapid movement across difficult terrain. Most importantly, these specialists could be combined in different configurations according to tactical requirements of particular situations. Intelligence gathering became a systematic science during this period, with networks of informants and analysts providing detailed information about enemy capabilities, political developments, and economic conditions throughout the known world. Merchants, diplomats, refugees, and prisoners were systematically debriefed to extract useful information, while specialized agents operated undercover in foreign courts and commercial centers. This intelligence enabled planners to design operations with precise knowledge of enemy strengths and weaknesses. Damascus fell in 732 BC, demonstrating these new capabilities in spectacular fashion. This ancient city, protected by massive fortifications and defended by experienced fighters, had previously withstood multiple attempts at capture. Operations that finally reduced it combined traditional assault techniques with innovative approaches specifically designed to overcome its defensive advantages. More importantly, speed with which Damascus fell shocked neighboring powers who had considered it impregnable. This offensive began with systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure surrounding the city, eliminating sources of food and revenue that might have sustained a prolonged defense. Simultaneously, diplomatic efforts isolated Damascus from potential allies, while engineering teams constructed earthworks and siege equipment necessary for direct assault. When final attack came, defenders found themselves facing coordinated pressure from multiple directions, against which their static defenses proved inadequate. Treatment of conquered Damascus revealed sophisticated approaches to integration that distinguished this period from earlier territorial acquisitions. Rather than destroying the city or massacring its inhabitants, conquerors implemented policies designed to transform it into a productive component of the expanding realm. Strategic relocations removed potential leaders of opposition while leaving economic infrastructure intact. New settlers from other areas were brought in to replace displaced inhabitants, creating communities with no historical attachment to local independence movements. Israel's destruction in 722 BC under Tiglath-Pileser's successor followed similar patterns, but on an even larger scale. Northern Kingdom had been weakening for decades through internal conflicts and external pressures, making it vulnerable to systematic subjugation despite its strategic location and considerable resources. Operations that eliminated it as an independent political entity demonstrated how effectively the reformed system could exploit enemy weaknesses while avoiding prolonged struggles that had characterized earlier expansion efforts. Relocation programs implemented following Israel's fall moved approximately 27,290 people, according to royal inscriptions, though actual numbers were probably higher. These demographic transfers were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned engineering, designed to eliminate cultural foundations of potential opposition. Skilled craftsmen, educated scribes, and religious leaders were dispersed throughout the territorial expanse, while farmers and laborers from other areas were settled in their former homes. Founding of Dur-Sharrukin represented the ultimate expression of royal ambition during this period. This new capital, constructed from nothing, according to Sargon II's personal specifications, was designed to accommodate needs of a universal monarchy. Its palaces could house diplomatic representatives of dozens of subject and allied peoples, while its archives were planned to manage correspondence generated by directing affairs on 3 continents. Construction projects themselves demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. Thousands of workers, drawn from every corner of the territorial expanse, labored for over a decade to create a city that would serve as command center of the known world. Specialized craftsmen produced decorative elements that incorporated artistic traditions from every major cultural region, while engineers solved unprecedented technical challenges related to supplying such a massive urban center. Yet even as Dur-Sharrukin neared completion, its royal sponsor was planning operations that would dwarf all previous achievements. Southern domains that had been the homeland's ancient rival beckoned as the next logical target for incorporation. A great southern metropolis, though weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures, remained a formidable obstacle that would test every capability northern forces had developed. Sennacherib, who inherited the throne in 704 BC following his father's death in battle, found himself confronting challenges that required modifications to strategies that had proved so successful in previous decades. Southern cities' cultural prestige, religious significance, and commercial importance made it fundamentally different from other targets. Simple destruction or demographic replacement would eliminate the very qualities that made the metropolis valuable, while allowing it to maintain traditional autonomy invited continued defiance. Solutions initially attempted involved installing puppet rulers who would govern according to northern interests, while maintaining appearances of local independence. This approach had worked effectively in smaller cities, but the southern center's size and complexity defeated such arrangements. Local elites possessed too many opportunities for intrigue, while inhabitants retained too strong an attachment to traditional independence to accept even indirect foreign oversight. Repeated uprisings throughout the 690s BC demonstrated inadequacy of moderate approaches to southern problems. Each outbreak required expensive operations to suppress, while underlying causes of opposition remained unaddressed. Growing frustration with these endless cycles of revolt and reconquest eventually led to more extreme measures than any predecessor had contemplated. Destruction of Great Southern Babylon in 689 BC marked both the pinnacle of northern capabilities and the beginning of serious political difficulties that would plague the dynasty for generations. Operations themselves succeeded completely. City walls were demolished, temples destroyed, inhabitants massacred or relocated, and very foundations flooded with diverted river water. Yet psychological impact of destroying such an ancient and revered cultural center generated shock and horror throughout the civilized world. Religious authorities from every major cultural tradition condemned sacrilege of destroying temples and dispersing divine statues that had been venerated for millennia. Even within northern domains, many questioned wisdom of policies that seemed to violate fundamental principles governing relationships between conquerors and conquered peoples. Sennacherib, who had ordered the destruction, found himself increasingly isolated, opposed not only by foreign enemies, but by significant portions of his own subjects. Uprising that eventually cost this ruler his life in 681 BC stemmed directly from controversies generated by his southern policies. His assassination while praying in a temple was widely interpreted as divine punishment for his sacrilegious destruction of ancient sacred sites. Civil war that followed saw competing claimants to the throne adopting different positions regarding proper relationships between Northern Realm and its southern domains. Esarhaddon, victor in this succession struggle, brought to power a leader whose approach to governance differed dramatically from his father's methods. Rather than relying primarily on force and intimidation, this new monarch emphasized restoration, reconciliation, and cultural synthesis as instruments of policy. His first major act was to order complete reconstruction of southern metropolis, according to traditional architectural principles, while incorporating elements that acknowledged northern sovereignty. This reversal of previous policies required enormous expenditures of resources and political capital, but it succeeded in resolving many problems that had plagued earlier attempts to integrate southern domains. Southern elites who had been implacably opposed to northern rule found themselves offered opportunities to participate in governance while maintaining their cultural identities. Religious authorities received guarantees that ancient traditions would be respected and supported by royal resources. Egyptian ventures that dominated this ruler's later reign represented the most ambitious operations ever attempted by any Mesopotamian power. Land of Pharaoh's wealth, strategic location, and cultural prestige made it an irresistible target, while its political fragmentation offered opportunities for sophisticated diplomatic and tactical strategies that had proved so effective elsewhere. Challenges involved in projecting power across such enormous distances would test every capability the Northern Realm had developed. Initial phases of Nile operations demonstrated both strengths and limitations of the reformed system. Logistical achievements required to maintain large forces during months-long marches across desert terrain exceeded anything previously attempted, while tactical flexibility that enabled successful operations against diverse enemy forces validated decades of professional development. However, geographical and cultural challenges of governing areas separated from homeland by such vast distances revealed fundamental constraints that no amount of organizational sophistication could overcome. Memphis fell to northern forces in 671 BC after a brief struggle that highlighted technological advantages developed through centuries of siege warfare experience. Ancient capitals' fortifications, though impressive by local standards, proved inadequate against assault techniques that had been refined through operations against far more formidable obstacles. More importantly, speed with which this culturally and strategically crucial city surrendered shocked opposition movements throughout the Nile Valley. Establishment of northern oversight over lower Nile regions required innovations that pushed organizational capabilities to their practical limits. Communication between Nile Delta and Mesopotamian heartland required weeks under best conditions, while cultural differences between pharaonic and northern traditions created integration challenges far more complex than anything previously encountered. Appointment of native officials under northern oversight represented compromise solutions that acknowledged these realities while maintaining sovereignty. Tribute payments from Nile domains provided the northern realm with unprecedented access to African resources, gold from Nubian mines, exotic animals for royal menageries, ivory and ebony for luxury manufactures, and incense for religious ceremonies. More importantly, control of pharaonic trade networks provided access to commercial relationships extending deep into Africa and around the Indian Ocean, dramatically expanding economic foundations supporting further expansion. Yet Nile achievements also revealed ultimate limits of ancient organizational capabilities. Distances involved in governing domains, extending from Armenian mountains to Nile cataracts, strained communication networks beyond their effective capacity, while cultural diversity, encompassed within such vast territorial expanse, created integration challenges that no existing system could adequately address. Success along the Nile paradoxically demonstrated that Northern Realm had reached practical boundaries of sustainable expansion. Tribal confederations that emerged along the realm's Arabian borders during this period presented challenges fundamentally different from anything encountered in previous expansion efforts. These nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples possessed mobility that enabled them to strike at vulnerable targets throughout the territorial expanse, while avoiding concentrated retaliation that had proved so effective against settled enemies. Their decentralized political organization meant that defeating specific tribal leaders provided no guarantee against continued attacks from other groups. Economic pressures generated by governing such extensive territorial expanse began manifesting in ways that threatened long-term stability. Tribute revenues that flowed toward the center, though enormous in absolute terms, were increasingly consumed by costs of maintaining control over distant domains. Garrison forces required to secure Nile Valley, Anatolia, Iran, and Levant simultaneously represented permanent commitments that limited flexibility previously enjoyed by royal forces. Cultural tensions created by ruling diverse peoples with radically different languages, religious traditions, and social organizations generated persistent opposition movements that required constant attention and resources to suppress. Relocation policies that had proved so effective in earlier periods became increasingly difficult to implement on scales necessary to eliminate defiance throughout such vast domains, while complexity of managing ethnically mixed communities strained governmental capabilities. By 669 BC, when Esarhaddon's remarkable reign ended, Northern Realm commanded domains more extensive than any power in human history had previously controlled. From shores of Mediterranean to Iranian plateau, from mountains of Armenia to deserts of Arabia, a single system directed affairs of dozens of peoples, speaking scores of languages and practicing countless cultural traditions. Achievement was unprecedented, yet strains created by governing such diversity across such distances were becoming increasingly apparent. Now the stage was set for the final act of this remarkable experiment in universal governance. His successor would inherit capabilities that enabled him to crush any conceivable enemy. Yet he would also face challenges that no amount of power could permanently resolve. Northern Realm had achieved everything its founders had dreamed of, and more, but success itself had created problems that would ultimately prove beyond any solution. Final blaze burned brightest of all when Ashurbanipal ascended the throne in 669. He inherited the largest dominion in human history, a continental expanse stretching from the Nile cataracts to the Iranian highlands, encompassing dozens of peoples and hundreds of cities under a single crown. Yet within this apparent triumph lay the seeds of catastrophic collapse. Very success that had elevated his dynasty to unprecedented heights had generated forces that no amount of wisdom or strength would ultimately control. Unlike his warrior predecessors who had built their reputations through endless campaigns and territorial acquisition, Ashurbanipal represented something entirely new in the annals of kingship. A scholar monarch whose greatest passion lay not in conquest, but in the accumulation and preservation of knowledge. His palace at Nineveh housed what would become the world's most comprehensive collection of written materials, a systematic attempt to gather the intellectual heritage of every culture within his vast domain. Royal Library that emerged from this ambitious project contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets covering every conceivable subject: literature, religion, science, medicine, law, history, and administration. Scribes working under royal patronage copied texts from throughout Mesopotamia, as scholars translated works from Egyptian, Elamite, and other foreign traditions. Most remarkably, this collection included multiple versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, ensuring that this foundational work of world literature would survive for modern rediscovery. This scholarly endeavor reflected a profound transformation in how the ruling class understood their role and responsibilities. Previous monarchs had justified their authority primarily through military prowess and divine favor, presenting themselves as warriors chosen by the gods to impose order through force. Ashurbanipal's approach emphasized synthesis and intellectual achievement, suggesting that true greatness lay in preserving and transmitting human knowledge, rather than simply accumulating territory and tribute. Palace reliefs commissioned during his reign depicted this new royal ideology with unprecedented sophistication. Instead of focusing exclusively on battlefield victories and enemy submission, these artistic programs celebrated intellectual achievements that distinguished civilized society from barbarism. Famous lion hunt scenes, though demonstrating royal courage and skill, served primarily as metaphors for the monarch's role in protecting civilization from forces of chaos and destruction. These lion hunts themselves represented extraordinary displays of royal authority and organizational capability. Captured lions were released in enclosed parks where the king demonstrated his prowess under controlled conditions that minimized actual danger yet maximized dramatic impact. Elaborate ceremonies surrounding these events brought together thousands of spectators from throughout the kingdom, generating shared experiences that reinforced loyalty to central authority and celebrated achievements that justified its existence. Yet even as Ashurbanipal cultivated this image of enlightened rulership, he proved himself capable of military ruthlessness that surpassed anything his predecessors had achieved. Systematic destruction of Elam between 647 and 639 represented perhaps the most complete act of elimination in history. This eastern neighbor, which had plagued Mesopotamian rulers for centuries through raids and support for local rebellions, was not merely conquered, but erased as a functioning civilization. Elamite campaign began as a response to their support for a major uprising in southern Mesopotamia, but it evolved into something far more comprehensive and terrible. Ashurbanipal's armies didn't simply defeat Elamite troops and occupy their cities. They systematically destroyed every trace of Elamite culture and identity. Temples were demolished, libraries burned, royal tombs violated, and entire populations either massacred or deported to distant corners of the kingdom, where their distinctiveness would inevitably disappear. Royal inscriptions describing this campaign reveal a level of calculated brutality that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to harsh realities of warfare. I destroyed the temples of Elam to their foundations. I scattered their gods and goddesses to the winds. I made the land of Elam into ruins and salt waste. Psychological impact of such complete destruction served as a warning to other potential challengers. and demonstrated that even the most proud civilizations faced elimination entirely if they dared oppose royal authority. This Elamite genocide, horrific though it was, proved to be Ashurbanipal's last great military triumph. Resources and effort required to achieve such complete destruction had strained the kingdom's capabilities to their limits, and psychological impact of such extreme measures had generated unease even among traditionally loyal populations. More importantly, this campaign had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the system that no amount of military success would address. Civil war that erupted in 652 between Ashurbanipal and his brother Shamash-Shumukin exposed artificial nature of unity that held the vast kingdom together. This fraternal conflict, which lasted 4 devastating years, saw southern regions rally behind the younger brother's claim to independence as the heartland supported the established monarch. Resulting struggle consumed enormous resources and demonstrated that even members of the royal family were not to be trusted to maintain solidarity. Shamash-Shumukin had been appointed to govern southern regions as part of a carefully planned succession arrangement designed to prevent exactly the kind of civil conflict that eventually erupted. His initial loyalty and competent administration had seemed to validate wisdom of dividing governmental responsibilities between trusted family members. However, prolonged residence in the south had gradually transformed him from a loyal deputy into an advocate for regional interests that increasingly conflicted with central priorities. Roots of this fraternal conflict lay in fundamental contradictions within the system that had been growing more severe as the kingdom expanded beyond manageable limits. Southern regions possessed traditions and economic interests that differed substantially from those of the heartland. Attempts to integrate these areas into a unified system had generated persistent tensions that were suppressed but never entirely eliminated. When civil war finally erupted, it revealed extent to which unity depended on personal relationships and temporary expedients rather than genuine institutional foundations. Cities and regions throughout the kingdom chose sides based on local calculations of advantage, rather than any deep loyalty to central institutions. Conflict became a test not of competing ideologies or governmental systems, but of which faction would more effectively exploit diverse grievances and ambitions that existed throughout the territorial expanse. Siege of southern capital that dominated the middle years of this conflict demonstrated both military capabilities that had made the kingdom dominant and economic costs that would ultimately destroy it. For over 2 years, massive armies surrounded the city as siege engines systematically reduced its defenses. Resources committed to this single operation exceeded what previous monarchs had expended on entire campaigns, yet success required sustained effort that prevented effective response to other challenges emerging throughout the kingdom. When Southern Stronghold finally fell in 648, victory proved Pyrrhic in ways that became apparent only gradually. Destruction required to achieve success had eliminated much of economic infrastructure that had made the region valuable, and resources consumed during the siege had depleted central treasury to dangerous levels. More importantly, harsh measures required to prevent future rebellions had alienated populations whose cooperation was essential for stability. Massacre and deportation programs implemented following this victory represented culmination of policies that had been developing throughout the dynasty's reign. Entire districts were emptied of their original inhabitants, who were either executed or relocated to distant areas where they posed no future threat. Demographic engineering that had proved so effective in earlier conquests was applied with unprecedented thoroughness, generating ethnically mixed populations throughout the kingdom that had no historical basis for resistance to central authority. Yet these same policies that had been instrumental in earlier successes now generated problems that threatened the system's long-term viability. Constant movement of populations disrupted economic relationships that had developed over centuries, reducing agricultural productivity and commercial efficiency. More importantly, complexity of managing such diverse and artificially created communities strained governmental capabilities beyond their effective limits. Economic difficulties that had been manageable during periods of successful expansion became critical as territorial growth reached its practical limits. Tribute system that had funded operations assumed continued acquisition of new sources of wealth, but the kingdom had now encompassed virtually every economically significant region within reach of transportation networks. Existing tributaries were approaching limits of what they could provide without destroying their own productive capacity. Costs of maintaining control over such vast domains continued increasing even as new sources of revenue became unavailable. Garrison troops required to secure Egypt, Anatolia, Iran, and other distant regions represented permanent commitments that consumed enormous resources, though contributing nothing to further expansion. Communication networks, administrative personnel, and infrastructure maintenance all required ongoing expenditures that had to be funded from existing sources rather than plunder from new conquests. Popular resistance to policies intensified as novelty of foreign rule wore off, and local populations began developing strategies for preserving their traditional identities, despite official pressure for assimilation. Religious movements emerged that provided frameworks for maintaining distinctiveness while appearing to comply with requirements. Underground networks preserved local languages, customs, and political aspirations that official policies were designed to eliminate. Emergence of new external threats during Ashurbanipal's later reign revealed how the kingdom's apparent strength had become a source of fundamental vulnerability. Scythian raids that devastated regions exploited the same mobility advantages that Aramean tribes had used centuries earlier, but on a much larger scale. These nomadic confederations possessed military capabilities comparable to royal armies, yet enjoyed strategic advantages that came from operating in familiar terrain with secure bases beyond reach. More dangerous still was gradual coalescence of opposition among peoples who had previously been too divided or distant to coordinate resistance effectively. Medes, who controlled much of the Iranian plateau, began developing political and military institutions capable of challenging authority directly. Their growing cooperation with other disaffected groups raised the possibility of coordinated resistance on a scale that no previous opposition movement had achieved. Internal succession disputes that followed Ashurbanipal's death around 631 provided opportunities for external enemies and internal dissidents that transformed manageable problems into existential threats. Civil war between competing claimants to the throne saw different factions seeking support from foreign powers and promising concessions that would have been unthinkable during periods of strength. These desperate expedients undermined prestige and authority that had been fundamental to control. Nabopolassar's rise to authority in southern regions during this period of confusion represented more than a simple dynastic change. It marked emergence of a new political entity that explicitly rejected central authority, yet possessed military and administrative capabilities necessary to make such rejection effective. This Chaldean leader understood both sources of strength and vulnerabilities that determined opponents with adequate resources and strategic vision were able to exploit. Alliance between southern rebels and Median Confederation generated a combination of capabilities that weakened central government was unable to counter effectively. Southern expertise in siege warfare and urban administration complemented Median mobility and access to Iranian resources, as both partners possessed detailed knowledge of weaknesses gained through centuries of subordination. Their coordination represented a level of strategic cooperation that previous opposition movements had been unable to achieve. Systematic reduction of strongholds throughout the kingdom during final decades of the 7th century demonstrated how quickly apparent strength dissolved when fundamental problems remained unresolved. Cities that had seemed secure under protection found themselves unable to resist determined enemies who understood their defensive weaknesses and possessed technical capabilities necessary to exploit them. Ashur, Heartland's city that had given its name to the entire enterprise, fell to Allied armies in 614 after a siege that revealed how completely the strategic situation had been transformed. Religious and symbolic significance of this victory resonated throughout the region, convincing previously neutral populations that authority was collapsing irreversibly. Psychological impact of losing such a significant center proved as damaging as immediate military consequences. Final siege of Nineveh itself began in 612, with allied armies of Nabopolassar and Kyaxares of Media surrounding the great capital that had directed affairs across 3 continents for over a century. City's massive defenses, enhanced over generations to withstand any conceivable assault, proved inadequate against enemies who possessed detailed knowledge of their weaknesses and unlimited time to exploit them systematically. Archaeological evidence from destruction layers reveals thoroughness with which victorious allies eliminated this center of authority. Palace walls were toppled, archives burned, treasures looted, and defensive works systematically demolished to ensure that Nineveh would never again serve as a base for restoration. Monuments that had celebrated achievements for generations were destroyed so completely that their very locations would be forgotten until modern archaeological investigation rediscovered them. 3-month siege that preceded this destruction represented the final act of a political system that had dominated the world for over 3 centuries. When walls were finally breached and enemy troops poured into the city, they were eliminating not just a capital, but the administrative center of the largest political entity that had ever existed. Scribes, officials, craftsmen, and soldiers who died in the final assault took with them accumulated expertise that had made administration possible. With Nineveh's fall, dreams of universal monarchy that had inspired generations of rulers died as well. Remnant armies that escaped to Haran represented the last flicker of authority, but they possessed neither the resources nor institutional foundations necessary for meaningful resistance. When this final stronghold fell in 609, it marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of humanity's first experiment in continental-scale political organization. Speed and completeness of collapse shocked contemporary observers who had assumed that such a vast and apparently stable system possessed inherent stability. Yet destruction of Nineveh revealed that this edifice had been far more fragile than anyone had realized. Success itself had generated contradictions and weaknesses that no amount of military strength or administrative sophistication would ultimately resolve. Ashurbanipal, who had accumulated humanity's largest library and commanded humanity's most extensive domains, had been destroyed by movements that his own policies had helped generate. Kingdom that had seemed destined for eternal dominance had discovered limits of what political organization was able to achieve. An age of universal empire was ending, but its memory would inspire future conquerors for millennia to come. Smoke had barely cleared from Nineveh's burning palaces when victorious allies began implementing the very administrative techniques their former masters had perfected. Nabopolassar's scribes copied Assyrian governmental procedures. His engineers studied Assyrian siege methods, and his diplomats adopted Assyrian protocols for managing subject peoples. Destroyers of the empire had become its inheritors, preserving in practice what they had eliminated in name. This ironic transformation would characterize the entire aftermath of Assyrian collapse. The empire's political structure died, but its innovations lived on to shape every subsequent attempt at large-scale governance. The Persian Empire, that eventually absorbed both the Neo-Babylonian and Median kingdoms, represented the most direct continuation of Assyrian imperial tradition. When Cyrus the Great organized his vast dominions, he drew heavily on administrative models that had been refined through centuries of Assyrian experimentation. Satrapy system that governed Persian regions from India to Greece operated according to principles virtually identical to those developed by Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors. Provincial governors appointed by and answerable to central authority, standardized tribute assessments, systematic communication networks, and carefully planned population transfers. All the hallmarks of Persian administration had been pioneered in the palaces of Calhu and Nineveh. Even famous tolerance that characterized Persian rule toward local customs and religious traditions represented an evolution of late Assyrian policies rather than a revolutionary departure from them. Esarhaddon's reconstruction of Babylon and Ashurbanipal's preservation of diverse texts had demonstrated that imperial stability could be enhanced through accommodation rather than systematic destruction. Persians simply refined and expanded these approaches, establishing ideological frameworks that would enable their empire to endure for over 2 centuries. Deportation policies that had been central to Assyrian imperial strategy continued under Persian rule, though typically on smaller scales and with greater attention to maintaining economic productivity. The Persian practice of relocating skilled craftsmen and administrative personnel to regions where their expertise was most needed followed patterns established centuries earlier by Assyrian planners. Even Persian postal system, celebrated in classical sources for its efficiency and reliability, operated along routes and according to principles that had been developed to serve Assyrian imperial communications. Babylon's brief renaissance under Nebuchadnezzar II and his successors demonstrated how thoroughly Assyrian imperial techniques had been absorbed throughout Mesopotamia. Neo-Babylonian Empire's construction projects, military organization, and diplomatic practices all reflected learning acquired during centuries of Assyrian dominance. When Babylonian forces captured Jerusalem and deported its elite to Mesopotamian cities, they were implementing demographic policies perfected by their former masters. Hanging gardens that made Babylon one of the world's wonders were constructed using engineering techniques developed in Assyrian royal workshops. Influence on biblical tradition proved equally profound and far more enduring than any political inheritance. Hebrew Bible preserves memories of Assyrian dominance that shaped Jewish theological thinking for centuries after the empire's collapse. Figure of Assyria became synonymous with divine judgment, representing the instrument through which God punished his chosen people for their failures, while simultaneously demonstrating the ultimate fate awaiting all earthly powers that challenged divine authority. Book of Isaiah's prophecies against Assyria provided frameworks for understanding imperial authority that would influence religious and political thought throughout Western tradition. Image of mighty empire brought low through divine intervention became a recurring theme in apocalyptic literature, while detailed descriptions of Assyrian military practices preserved in biblical texts provided some of the most vivid contemporary accounts of warfare available to later generations. Story of Jonah and Nineveh, whether historical or legendary, captured something essential about how the empire's memory functioned in post-collapse imagination. Great city that could repent and receive divine mercy represented a complex understanding of imperial dominance that acknowledged both its terrible destructive capability and its potential for transformation. This nuanced view would influence how later civilizations understood relationships between political authority and moral responsibility. Archaeological confirmation of biblical accounts enhanced historical credibility of these texts, while providing concrete evidence for Assyrian imperial practices. Discovery of Sennacherib's annals describing his siege of Jerusalem corroborated biblical narrative, while revealing sophisticated propaganda techniques that had been central to Assyrian psychological warfare. Detailed accounts of tribute payments, deportation programs, and administrative procedures preserved in royal inscriptions provided unprecedented insights into how empires actually functioned. Rediscovery of Assyrian civilization in the 19th century generated a sensation that fundamentally transformed understanding of history and human development. When Austen Henry Layard's excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh revealed magnificent palaces buried beneath millennia of accumulated debris, they opened a window into a lost world that had been preserved in biblical memory, but forgotten in historical reality. Bas-reliefs depicting royal lion hunts, siege warfare, and tribute ceremonies provided visual evidence for a level of artistic sophistication that challenged prevailing assumptions about primordial barbarism. Decipherment of cuneiform script unlocked archives containing hundreds of thousands of documents that illuminated every aspect of Assyrian society and administration. These texts revealed the existence of libraries, schools, law codes, medical treatises, astronomical observations, and literary works that demonstrated intellectual achievements rivaling those of any civilization. Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in Ashurbanipal's library, emerged as humanity's oldest known work of literature, while mathematical and scientific texts revealed levels of sophistication that influenced development of these disciplines throughout the world. Systematic nature of Assyrian record-keeping provided modern scholars with documentary evidence for historical events, administrative procedures, and cultural practices that could be verified through archaeological investigation. Royal annals describing specific campaigns could be correlated with destruction layers at mentioned sites, while administrative documents revealed practical details of how empires actually functioned. This wealth of primary source material made Assyrian civilization one of the best documented periods of history. Influence on military theory and practice extended far beyond classical world into modern strategic thinking. Systematic integration of different combat arms that characterized mature Assyrian forces provided models for military organization that remained relevant throughout the pre-gunpowder era. Use of siege engines, coordinated infantry cavalry operations, and systematic logistics planning became standard elements of effective military practice that were refined but never fundamentally altered until introduction of firearms changed warfare's nature entirely. More significantly, psychological warfare techniques pioneered by Assyrian rulers established principles that continued to influence military and political strategy into the modern era. Calculated use of terror to discourage resistance, systematic dissemination of propaganda to demoralize enemies and encourage submission, and strategic manipulation of religious symbols to legitimize authority became permanent features of imperial practice. Every subsequent empire, from Rome to the British Empire, employed variations of techniques that had been perfected in palaces of Assyrian kings. Administrative innovations that enabled effective governance over continental distances provided templates for imperial organization that influenced political development throughout classical and medieval worlds. Roman Empire's provincial system, Chinese Empire's bureaucratic administration, and Islamic Caliphate's governmental structure all incorporated elements that had been pioneered by Assyrian administrators. fundamental challenge of maintaining central control over diverse populations across vast distances required solutions that varied in detail, but followed principles established during centuries of Assyrian experimentation. Concept of universal monarchy that had inspired Assyrian imperial ideology continued to influence political thinking long after the empire's collapse. Idea that legitimate authority could and should extend over all peoples and regions became a recurring theme in imperial propaganda from Alexander the Great through Roman emperors to medieval concept of universal Christian empire. Even modern notions of international law and global governance reflect intellectual traditions that can be traced back to Assyrian claims about the nature and scope of legitimate political authority. Demographic impact of Assyrian deportation policies produced ethnic and cultural mixing throughout the Middle East that influenced the region's development for millennia. Forced movement of populations during the imperial period generated synthesis that enriched artistic, intellectual, and religious traditions while eliminating many local variations that had characterized earlier periods. Cosmopolitan character of Hellenistic and Roman civilization owed much to demographic engineering that had been systematically implemented by Assyrian administrators. Preservation of Mesopotamian traditions through the imperial period ensured that literary, scientific, and artistic achievements spanning 3 millennia would be transmitted to later civilizations. Libraries of Assyrian kings contained copies of texts dating back to the earliest periods of urban civilization, while their patronage of scribal schools and scholarly activity maintained intellectual traditions that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political upheaval. Astronomical observations recorded in Assyrian archives provided data that influenced development of mathematical astronomy throughout classical world. Systematic tracking of celestial phenomena that had been undertaken for astrological purposes established datasets that Greek and Islamic scholars would later use to develop more sophisticated theoretical models. Sexagesimal number system that had been used for astronomical calculations became foundation for mathematical traditions that continue to influence how we measure time and angles today. Artistic traditions established in Assyrian palace workshops influenced visual expression throughout the Near East and beyond. Narrative relief sculptures that decorated royal palaces provided models for historical art that were copied and adapted by Persian, Greek, and Roman artists. Systematic use of visual imagery to communicate political messages became a standard feature of imperial propaganda that continued through medieval period into modern political art. Legal principles embedded in Assyrian law codes contributed to development of jurisprudence throughout the region. Systematic organization of legal precedents, standardization of penalties, and concept of universal application of law, regardless of local customs, provided models that influenced legal development from Persian Empire through Islamic law. Harsh punishments that characterized Assyrian legal practice became associated with imperial authority generally, while administrative procedures for implementing legal decisions influenced governmental practice throughout the world. Economic policies that had sustained Assyrian imperial expansion established patterns of resource extraction and redistribution that characterized imperial practice for centuries. Tribute system that channeled wealth from subject regions to imperial centers became standard model for imperial finance, while techniques for assessing economic productivity and managing commercial relationships provided precedents that influenced trade and taxation policies throughout classical world. Religious synthesis that had been encouraged under Assyrian rule contributed to development of syncretic traditions that would eventually influence emergence of monotheistic religions. systematic preservation of diverse religious texts in imperial libraries, accommodation of local religious practices within imperial frameworks, and development of theological justifications for universal rule all contributed to intellectual traditions that would influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Ultimate failure of Assyrian imperial experiment provided equally valuable lessons about limits of political organization, inability to maintain effective control over regions that exceeded capacity of communication and transportation. Technology demonstrated constraints that would challenge every subsequent imperial venture. Resistance that eventually undermined imperial unity revealed difficulties inherent in governing diverse populations without adequate mechanisms for integration. Economic problems that had contributed to imperial collapse illustrated unsustainability of governmental systems that depended on continuous territorial expansion to maintain their fiscal viability. Lesson that imperial success could generate problems as serious as imperial failure would be repeatedly learned by later empires that achieved comparable levels of territorial control, only to discover that governing such vast domains required resources that exceeded their capacity to provide. Speed with which apparently mighty empire had collapsed provided sobering reminders about fragility of political institutions that seem permanent to their contemporary inhabitants. Destruction of Nineveh demonstrated that even the most sophisticated administrative systems and military establishments could be overwhelmed when fundamental problems remained unresolved and external pressures exceeded the system's capacity to respond effectively. Yet memory of Assyrian achievement continued to inspire ambitious rulers who believed they could succeed where their predecessors had failed. Alexander the Great's vision of universal monarchy, Roman Empire's claims to worldwide dominion, and medieval concept of universal empire all reflected continuing belief in possibilities that Assyrian rulers had been first to attempt systematically. Dream of unifying known world under single authority remained compelling despite repeated demonstrations of its practical impossibility. Intellectual legacy proved more enduring than any political inheritance. Libraries, schools, and scholarly traditions that had flourished under imperial patronage established frameworks for preserving and transmitting knowledge that survived collapse of political system that had sponsored them. Techniques for organizing information, maintaining archives, and conducting systematic research that had been developed in Assyrian institutions influenced educational practice throughout the world. Modern understanding of imperial practice derives largely from Assyrian sources that provide unparalleled documentation of how such systems actually functioned. Detailed records maintained by imperial administrators, systematic nature of royal inscriptions, and archaeological preservation of imperial centers have established a body of evidence that enables modern scholars to understand imperialism with a level of detail impossible for any earlier period. Moral questions raised by Assyrian imperial practice continue to influence contemporary debates about authority and relationships between political effectiveness and ethical responsibility. Systematic use of terror, implementation of demographic engineering, and subordination of individual rights to imperial requirements anticipated moral dilemmas that would recur throughout human history. Assyrian example provided both cautionary tales about dangers of unconstrained authority and practical demonstrations of what determined leadership could accomplish. In the end, greatest legacy of Assyrian civilization may be its demonstration that human political organization could transcend tribal and regional limitations to establish institutions capable of governing continental regions and diverse populations. This experiment failed, but it established precedents and possibilities that would inspire political development throughout subsequent history. Empire that had sought to impose order on the entire known world had indeed transformed it, though not in ways its founders had anticipated. Story of Assyrian rise and fall became a permanent part of human memory, preserved in religious texts, historical accounts, and archaeological remains that continue to yield new insights into humanity's first experiment with universal governance. Palace reliefs that had celebrated imperial achievement became monuments to vanished ambition, while cuneiform tablets that had recorded imperial administration became sources for understanding how complex political systems actually function. Empire that had dominated the world for 3 centuries continued to influence human civilization long after its political authority had turned to dust. From modest trading post beside the Tigris to the greatest empire the world had known, from patient accumulation of commercial wealth to systematic conquest of 3 continents, from development of iron weapons to perfection of siege warfare, from codification of harsh laws to preservation of humanity's literary heritage, Assyrian achievement encompassed the full range of human capability for both creation and destruction. Their legacy endures not in monuments of stone, but in continuing human struggle to balance requirements of order with demands of justice, needs of unity with claims of diversity, and possibilities of authority with constraints of wisdom.